I'm David Thoreau, president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our first of two events featuring Dr. José Yulo. Jose is a member of the board of directors of the C.S. Lewis Society of California and teaches at Academy of Art University in San Francisco and is a man of letters and many other things. So he's prepared presentations with PowerPoint on Christopher Dawson's book, Progress and Religion. And for those of you who are not familiar with it yet, we hope that you will dig into it because this is the third or fourth book we've done by Dawson, I guess, right, Jose?
Mm-hmm. Fourth one, I believe, yep. Mm-hmm.
Dawson was one of the great historians of the 20th century and included themes that most modern historians were not attentive to and had lost. And the reason why we're interested in Dawson is to bring some of that back. And I think you'll all agree with, as Jose will proceed, of the great value of Dawson's work. And Jose is adding to it. So Jose, thank you for doing this, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The book we're doing today is Progress and Religion again. This was Dawson's second book, and I've read that it's supposedly his most influential, and that's what piqued my interest in sharing this with you for these two meetings. Dawson is one of those rare historians who not only is able to look at history with a rather objective eye, but also is an historian who seemingly has a particular talent or gift to see through history, to see these strands interwoven throughout human history, and basically be able to, in many cases, make correlations that are very, very poignant with regards to different events and occurrences throughout human history. The particular format I'll be using for this presentation is what we also did last year. I like to call it the Grand Tour format. It's an homage to an old Yulo family friend, the American Jesuit James Donnellan, who was a very, very close Yulo family friend in the Philippines. He was an Oxford grad in English literature, and he used to have these back in the old days, yes, a videotape cassette, VHS type slide presentations, wherein he would show you, for instance, a famous work of art in Florence and Venice, and tie together the visual with what was actually happening at that time. So to make a correlation between aesthetics and also sociopolitics and perhaps geopolitics at the same time, what was occurring at that point and how it's reflected in the art. So I'm going to do something similar to that today. It's going to be a little bit different than last year, in that last year there was more of a chronological presentation of art. This one is more thematic, considering that Dawson talks of different themes throughout the book, and then which of course are not necessarily in a chronological order. And nevertheless, Dawson's book will focus on two main ideas. The first of these, of course, being progress, which will be our scope for today. And then next week, during the next meeting, we'll take on religion. I don't want to necessarily promise anything, but you may want to know that Dawson has a very interesting take on both and makes us challenge how we view the relationship of one to the other, if not challenge how we view our definitions of those terms to begin with. So to begin with our first quote and going on to our first visual, I'll be screen sharing in a little bit. This is Dawson in an almost Socratic way, in an almost, it's almost like a Platonic dialogue, trying to figure out and define what progress is. How do we understand this term? When exactly does it occur in the scope of human history? What is, excuse me, when does it have its footprint onto human history? He is quite specific in saying that it generally occurs during the time of the Enlightenment. So we're talking 18th century or so. And I'll draw your attention to page 18 in Progress and Religion. So what I'll be doing is reading a quote from Dawson and then showing you visuals that correspond to this and perhaps allow us to think more laterally and how to assimilate what Dawson is actually saying in a fuller way, if that's possible. So this is from page 18 in Dawson's book, Progress and Religion. This is roughly, let's see here, the first full paragraph down, beginning with finally. So I'll go with this one. Finally, the great humanitarian movement has destroyed slavery and swept away the barbarous punishments which are almost as old as civilization. while the introduction of universal education has entirely transformed the intellectual life of the masses. Looked at from this point of view, progress is no imaginary hypothesis, but a solid reality of history. Next paragraph down. But it is important to remember that this process of change is a strictly relative one. So far from being the necessary result of a universal process of evolution, which embraces the whole life of humanity, it is an exceptional and indeed unique achievement of a single society at a particular stage of its development. If you scroll down that paragraph a little bit, Dawson gives, or perhaps strikes, a bit of a cautionary note. He says, it may even be questioned, as indeed it has been questioned by many, whether the modern advance of material civilization is progressive in the true sense of the word, whether men are happier or wiser or better than they were in simpler states of society, and whether Birmingham or Chicago is to be preferred to medieval Florence. Now, with that in mind, where Dawson is telling us essentially that it happens during this particular time in history, of course, the 18th century, more or less the Enlightenment. But then he asks us, how do we truly know whether progress, I'm not trying to be cheeky by saying this, is progressive? How do we know progress is fulfilling its mission? It's fulfilling its telos, if you will, its purpose for being. So if I could share with you the first visual for today, and this is a painting from an author I'm sure you've heard from before, or perhaps seen before. This is a painting, of course, from Vincent Van Gogh. There are many, by the way, pronunciations. I only found out recently for Van Gogh. We've all heard the Van Gogh American pronunciation. I've also heard, apparently, the very strict Dutch pronunciation is more like Van Gogh. But I'll stick with the Van Gogh for now. It makes it a little bit easier. This is called First Steps by Vincent Van Gogh, and it is found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. If we look at this painting, I'd like you to think of two things as we're looking at visuals throughout this presentation. The two things being, I'd like you to take into consideration color, specifically color palette, and secondly, characters, specifically the arrangement of the characters in the particular visuals you're going to be seeing. So in this particular scene, this is called First Steps, by the way. The subtitle of this is After Millet. Van Gogh painted this as an homage to a French painter called Jean-François Millet, who was a specialist in portraying rural, pastoral, peasant life in France in the 19th century. Van Gogh was especially touched by Millet's actual work, which in contrast to what you're seeing right now, has a lot more earthy tones, a lot darker, sort of in note and in palette. Whereas this one, take note, of course, these are much more, I almost want to say Easter colors. These are much more bright pastels, connoting the spring, connoting a springtime where a farmer perhaps is planting. He is being greeted by his young child and the mother of the child in this scene. I'd like you to take a little bit of consideration to color palette, how bright it is, how promising perhaps Van Gogh wanted to portray this. In fact, when he was producing this painting in Saint-Rémy in France, ironically enough, he painted this while he was self-admitted to an asylum, the one in Saint-Rémy. He ends up writing a letter to his brother Theo. Theo's wife, Yulo, is expecting their first child. And Vincent, in a way, is trying to perhaps make a correlation between this painting and the expectant child of his brother Theo. In that letter, Vincent will say to Theo Van Gogh, "Ah, now certainly you are yourself deep in nature, since you say that Yulo already feels her child move. It is much more interesting even than landscapes, and I'm very glad that things should have changed so for you. How beautiful that Millet is, a child's first steps." When Vincent Van Gogh will write this to Theo, there is a sense of joy. You can see this, by the way, in the color palette. There is a sense of, how should we say, feeling for his brother, feeling very, very happy and joyful for his brother. But at the same time, there is also a sense with regard to Vincent Van Gogh that although he has been blessed more than Theo, his brother, in terms of talent, he is, after all, the artist, Theo is more the art dealer. Theo is about to be blessed with something that is much more perhaps fulfilling. There is very much this feeling from Vincent of joy for his brother, but at the same time, there is a sense that there's a little bit of bittersweet feeling that Vincent himself, with all of his great talent, does not live the kind of more or less normal, non-artistic life that his brother lives. The sad fact, of course, what happens after this painting is that a year later, about 1891, when Theo Van Gogh's child is born, he is a very happy father, of course, but shortly thereafter, Vincent dies. And as you guys probably know the story, yes, Theo doesn't live much longer than Vincent. Because of great empathy for his brother, he falls ill and eventually passes away. Nevertheless, this painting was chosen to convey this sense of joyfulness, of youth. But I'd like you to pay attention to a couple things. Notice, if you will, the house portrayed in the painting. It is taking up the middle space in perspective. It has more or less a thatched roof, i.e., this is not a grandiose mansion or manor house, of sorts. This is very much a house of people who are materially challenged. The farmer coming to meet his child does not look like he is shod very well. You're familiar with the saying, a well-heeled person. That literally meant a long time ago that you had shoes. There were people, across the centuries, what defined them as different from the nobility, as they simply weren't shod. In this case, the farmer has a very humble attire. Notice, if you will, this wheelbarrow towards the left of the screen. I'm guessing, I don't want to be sort of presumptuous by saying this, but this doesn't look like a farmer who is harvesting or planting wonderful grapes in the Napa Valley. He's not harvesting a whole bunch of Cab, or Merlot in Napa. Frankly, it looks like there's a whole bunch of dirt on that wagon. Not something that looks particularly lucrative, that the farmer can turn into something that will make him a lot of money and better the material condition of his family. But please remember, again, two things, right? While I switch to the next picture, the two things being color palette and character position. In this case, please remember, or please note, the father and the mother, although not looking directly at each other, are somewhat connected. There's a connectedness to the painting. And the connectedness comes from the child looking at the father looking back at the child, and then the mother looking down at the child. There's almost strands tying all of these figures together. There is not too much of separation. All the separation really is how far it is from the baby to run to her dad. But you see figures and people connected in this artwork with a much more, of course, with a very pleasing spring palette again. This is a painting by John Singer Sargent. By the way, if you a long way to go to New York City to find that Van Gogh, this Sargent painting is found at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. So it's a local product. It's right here in the city. Should you find or have some time to go visit. John Singer Sargent, as you guys probably know, was an American portraitist, perhaps one of the greatest portrait artists of the 19th century. He is very well known for his work depicting Theodore Roosevelt, a very stern, very almost imperial-looking Theodore Roosevelt in that portrait. The famous, or perhaps infamous, work by Sargent found at the Met in New York, if you're familiar with the work Madame X, of the American lady who moves to France, marries a French socialite, and has a rather racy reputation throughout Paris. That, of course, was masterfully done by Sargent. The title of this particular painting, the English title, is A Dinner Table at Night. But perhaps the more telling title is the French. Sargent, of course, was living in France at that time, or spent most of his life, his career in France. The title of this is Le Verre de Porto, the glass of port. You can see this, of course, held in the hand of the lady in the painting, a decanter of the port over here. A little bit of information on this painting. This was a portrait of a rather wealthy British couple, Edith and Albert Vickers. The Vickers family was a wealthy turn of the century, i.e. late Victorian era, British family that made their money in steel. up in the north of England. And some would say there is also a Vickers family relation that became very rich with, of all things, weapons. The Vickers machine gun was a new device that was coming to the fore, especially you'll see it in World War I and World War II. Now, the Vickers family is having dinner at their country house. They are having port. Please note again the two things I mentioned earlier to pay attention to: color palette and characters, how the characters are situated. If you note from the color palette, these are in contrast to the Van Gogh. These are autumnal colors, the dark reds, if you will, the deep and dark browns, the mahogany furniture, perhaps, very exotic mahogany furniture on the left-hand side. You see, in contrast, or perhaps bringing out the contrast of these very dark autumnal colors, you have the silverware at the table. Unique things about the silverware, yes. I'm guessing with a family that looks like it has the means that the Vickers family seems to have. I'm guessing these are not simply silver-plated jewelry you'll find somewhere, or your everyday jaunt to Target. I'm guessing something along the lines of, I don't know, Christophe or Baccarat, crystal for the decanter, a very, very fancy, very, very upscale decor they have. The gentleman in question here, Mr. Albert Vickers, is decked out as a typical Victorian gentleman would be at this time. One of the peculiar things, by the way, that kind of stopped being the case in the middle of the 20th century is back in this time period, believe it or not, there was day and evening wear, i.e. for gentlemen and women. I speak specifically for gentlemen. I would not be very permissible in the Victorian era. Brown, after 6 o'clock was generally not a thing, or tan. It had to be dark colors and black. With the look of Mr. Albert Vickers, he is a man of means. He doesn't look the equestrian type. So I'm guessing his suit, more or less, maybe Henry Poole of Savile Row, very traditional looking. He is having his after-dinner cigar. Mrs. Vickers is having her glass of port. I'll zoom in a little bit more to get a better picture. I'll apologize to Mr. Vickers. Oh, we still have him there. Okay. Mrs. Vickers is quite elegantly attired. She has jewelry. She has her hair made up very well, a wonderful gown. She is sharing this after-dinner glass of port with her husband. Think autumn. And the port, by the way, also connotes late in the day, i.e. you have port as a not aperitif, although you could, but it is more a digestif, something you have a little bit at the end of a meal. It is meant, by the way, as something that is to be enjoyed over a long period of time. It's something not just done, you don't do shots of port. It's blasphemy for me to say so, but you more or less enjoy this over a longer period of time. So again, in contrast to the Van Gogh, later in the day, more age in the picture. Color palette, yes? Let's focus on now something called character, and sort of where the characters are arrayed in contrast to each other. Please note, there are only two characters here, unlike the first painting by Van Gogh, but take note of where each is looking, of where each character has the focus of their attention. Mr. Vickers has had a probably pretty long day out in the city. He's back home to his country house. He's thinking about his investments, perhaps, maybe a trip to Africa for some hunting, who knows, with the port and the cigar. He does not seem to be looking directly at his wife, but maybe he is. But at least from my angle, he's not necessarily. More looking past her in this sense. Mrs. Vickers seems to be looking directly at the painter, looking directly at Sargent in this case, or whomever, or us who are the viewers of this particular work of art. One thing to notice, yes, the eyebrow raise in the left eyebrow of Mrs. Vickers. Now, that could be an eyebrow raise, that connoted some sort of interest or some sort of curiosity. It could be an eyebrow raise also to express, dare I say, and perhaps I'm extending myself a little bit here, dare I say, discontentment. Not necessarily being completely happy or content with the situation, thinking of something else that could be better. Now that you've seen this particular work and the work that I've shown you earlier with the Van Gogh, basic question I'd like to ask you, to ask all of you. is there progress between the rural peasant pastoral life you find in the Van Gogh and the much more urbane, much more sophisticated? The evening dinner, by the way, think of how the evening's food and beverages are arrayed, yes? They have access, the Vickers family has access to, they have controlled nature in a way. They have access to the fruit of nature, that being the port. They have access to the finery of metallurgy in the form of the fine silver that you see on the table. I've always wondered, by the way, what this particularly is. This is looking more and more like, to me, a champagne ice bucket, if you will. So perhaps that came before the port, before dinner. In comparison to that, you have this. Quick ironic note of both paintings. The Van Gogh was done in 1890. The Sargent was done in 1884. So the Sargent is actually a little bit older than the Van Gogh painting. Can we say then, and feel free to pipe up or send me messages or whatever, can we say that there is progress in the state of being of the people in the Van Gogh painting and the couple in the Sargent painting? Remember, Dawson is trying to ask us, is trying to say, look, we have to figure out first what exactly progress is. We have to figure this out. So is progress occurring between these two paintings? What is your take on this? Is there progress between Van Gogh and Sargent?
I would say no, there isn't.
There isn't. Okay.
Yeah, this is a fascinating comparison of these two pictures. Is the people in the first one look so happy and content and living a contented life, where these people do not seem contented.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of progress, it's not happening because of level of happiness.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So, which seems to be stronger in the first one and not exactly in this one.
That's right.
Okay, yeah. Very good. Can we discount, though, that the fact that the Vickers family is living a much more, how should I say this, a much more materially pleasurable life? They don't seem to be working with a wheelbarrow full of dirt, to put it in that way. They seem to be enjoying all the fine accoutrements of a wealthy bourgeois life in the Victorian era. They seemingly have less concern, less material concerns on their mind. Well, Mrs. Vickers kind of cues us in that maybe she has a little bit more concern than she's actually letting on by looking directly at the viewer and with that little eyebrow raise. I'm not entirely sure. So what would have made the Sargent painting, how would it have to look like to show that it really was progress from what you saw in the Van Gogh? What would have to be in it? Now, feel free. You can talk color palette, character, whatsoever.
If you're thinking of material progress, then clearly the Sargent painting is representing materially a far more progressive situation.
Yes.
In terms of the spiritual progress, one would think just the opposite, until one realizes that the Van Gogh family was actually a very troubled family. Perhaps it's not quite as simple as that.
Very good point. And so would you say that Vincent was painting this as an homage to Millet, but also in an almost, how should I say this, in a certain sense of longing, that he wished his and Theo's and their families' lives were a little bit more bucolic and simple than what they were? If we are to say that something is progressing materially, could we come up with certain criteria to at least make clear that these things have to be checked off, like a list almost, in order for something to be declared materially progressive? What would those things be?
I suppose the presumed prosperity of people represented would be one of the factors. And I imagine that this painting of Sargent's, if it was commissioned by the Vickers family, they probably wanted to show off their wealth and their culture, and commissioned Sargent to to do it in a way that would flatter them.
Very good.
Is that the case with the Van Gogh family? I don't think at all.
Would you say that the Van Gogh family would not have the need for the portrait or the painting? Whereas there's this thing that comes along with material progress. Allow me this one indulgence. Perhaps I'll ask for more than one this evening, but it's almost like an Instagram for the time. The idea that I've done well in my life, and I'm going to show it off to other people. I'm going to show off my port, my fine silverware and crystal, etc. I am living the life, so to speak. Whereas with the family in the Van Gogh painting, there doesn't seem to be this great, how should I say, need or requirement to portray their joy. They're simply enjoying it. They're simply living through that experience. So here we have Dawson asking us to examine what exactly we think progress is. Is it something material? Is it something that we can elaborate on and perhaps extend to something more spiritual, something more intellectual? But he comes around and says, and allow me to pull up the second reading for today. He comes around and says the people who lived in this particular time were not exactly the shy and retiring type, and that is the era of the Enlightenment, the late 1700s, which of course spilled over the 19th century. The people who lived in this time period, because of the great material advances they were able to put into play. By the way, it is not a small thing to undo slavery. It is not a small thing to come around eventually to antibiotics and wonderful technological advancements we've been able to enjoy today. So this is a quote from page 19 of Dawson's book, before he transitioned to the other slides, in describing the kind of people who were at the forefront of the Enlightenment and the idea of progress. So again, from page 19, it's the middle of the first broken paragraph up top. I'll go with this one. Today, few thinkers would be so bold as to identify the material advance of a modern European civilization with progress in the absolute sense. For we now realize that a civilization may prosper externally and grow daily larger and louder and richer and more self-confident, while at the same time it is decreasing in social vitality and losing its hold on its higher cultural traditions. It has, however, taken us 2 centuries to reach this position. The men of the 18th century, who were the actual creators of the new movement of European culture, were troubled by no such doubts. They had a complete confidence in the absolute and universal validity of the principles on which they based their action. Now focus on those terms, yes? This complete confidence, this idea that since we have mastered reason, which the members of the Enlightenment period strongly held very close to heart, since they were able to forego the trappings of older faith and cultural relics of the past, that they were able to do many things, and perhaps there were no boundaries to what they could do. If I could bring up now the next slide to show you, as an example of this confidence of this time period, this is the the summer palace of King Frederick of Prussia, otherwise known as Frederick the Great. It is called Sanssouci in German, from the French Sanssouci, which means without worries, of course. It was a rather unique construction, built in the mid to late 1700s or so by Frederick. He was very fond of this palace. It was his most ardent intention to be buried at this palace. And sadly for him, that only actually happened in the 1990s, perhaps after German unification during that time period. A couple things to bear in mind with this building, yes. The particular architectural style, by the way, of this time period, which extends from the exterior to the interior of buildings as well, is called Rococo. The Rococo style, of course, which comes it comes after Baroque, which is a much more, how should we say, grave and severe form of art, one that impresses on people emotionality and the power of the church and of God. Rococo is a much more, dare I say, secular form of interpreting aesthetics, of showing that there is a certain lightness to the way we want to convey what we think to the world. couple things about this picture from Sanssouci. Yes, first thing to pay attention to, color palette again. Whereas Baroque is known for its deep contrasts of color, dark reds, dark browns, and then light as a comparison. If you're familiar with the artist Caravaggio, of course, perhaps in my opinion, the greatest realist painter in history. If you're familiar with Caravaggio, you see this sort of interplay between light and dark. I was reading something the other day that said that the techniques of Baroque art, which you'll see, by the way, later on today, that's the very last slide we're seeing. The techniques of Baroque art will only later on be replicated by, unusually enough, the German expressionist movement in film of the early 20th century, in the 1920s, where there is again this very interesting play of light and dark to convey severity and to convey weight, W-E-I-G-H-T in that sense. So color palette of Sanssouci, we see this light creamy yellow on the outside. Again, kind of springtime colors, kind of bringing back a little bit the Van Gogh color palette with the blue over here. And the green on top of this dome. For the looks of it, it's either painted on, or my guess is it was a bronze dome that later on with time developed some sort of patina. I could be mistaken, but I can look into that a little bit more. Nevertheless, turning into this pretty nice mint green appearance, you know, it sort of lightens up things a little bit. There is in Baroque architecture the feeling that somehow when you are around it, that you are being lifted up a little bit. There's something uplifting, there's something positive and sort of light or airy, I should say, with regards to the aesthetic. Now, the curious thing, of course, is that while that is happening, while there is a lightening effect with the color palette of Baroque architecture, we're kind of curious as to what we're being elevated to. If you are familiar with Gothic architecture, of course, where if you enter the Duomo in Milan, the Stephan Dome in Vienna, with these huge vaulted ceilings and stained glass, there is very much a religious sense of being uplifted towards heaven, essentially, towards a higher plane of existence. But oddly enough, think of this architecture in Sanssouci. You have a light color palette uplifting people, making them feel perhaps more amiable about their day. Interesting to note, yes, this is one of the very few imperial or royal palaces in Europe at this time period where the people could walk around the grounds. There weren't guards screening you, or checking your ID to come into the grounds of Sanssouci. In fact, Frederick himself could be inside practicing his flute, could be conversing with Voltaire and a whole bunch of Enlightenment figures during this time who were invited to go to Sanssouci. And you could see basically bystanders on the outside, sort of hanging around, taking part of this wonderful aesthetic experience. But here's the curious part. Although the Baroque color palette uplifts, we're not exactly sure where it's uplifting us to. Please note, Sanssouci, unlike many palaces built during this period and before, has only one story. There's no other floors. You have one floor, and that's it. When you enter and do the tour, as myself, my wife, and my children were very fortunate to do back in 2015, a great trip to Germany and Austria. When you take the tour, there are, of course, cupolas and where these sort of domes, you can see the interior of them, but there isn't really a next story or a next floor. So why is this the case? What is the point to this? Now, please note, this is the era of Enlightenment, yes, where we move away from a sense of religiosity, which would impart to us verticality. The verticality being we are here on earth, God the Father, Holy Ghost, and Son are above us. With the Enlightenment, there is a moving away of that to say that why not focus on more earthly dimensions, a more earthly aesthetic? What can be beautiful here on earth instead of having to look constantly vertically, constantly upwards? Let's look at each other. Let's look at the wonders we can create with our reason, our science, and even, by the way, with our art. Who is to say that art needs to be religiously inspired? We can produce wonderful art, pretty art, very ornamental and opulent art that is not necessarily religiously inspired in that case. That is the exterior of Sanssouci. Allow me to show you the interior. Typical of Rococo interior design, we see a very free use of gold and gilt. But notice, if you take note of it, the gilding in this interior salon is rather irregular, not necessarily symmetrical, and the shapes being used are very organic. Leaf shapes that you find in nature. If you look above this wonderful chandelier, you see almost a spiderweb pattern up here at the top. Using what is in nature, not necessarily worrying about what is above, but using what is available to us in nature as a form of beautification, as a form of showing, hey, we are able in this age of egalitarianism, in a manner, to produce things that are excellent aesthetically. When you look at this finery inside the salon in Frederick the Great's palace, Sanssouci, one thing perhaps comes to mind. We talked about this term last year when I did the crisis of Western education. The term is an old Greek word called telos, T-E-L-O-S, which translates to purpose. What is the point to something? What is the reason we have this thing there? In the case of Rococo design, I was having a conversation recently with a good friend of mine who taught, like myself, at Campion College, a Catholic college here in San Francisco, some time back, when it was pointed out to me, very aptly so, that there's almost a sense when you look at Rococo design, right? When you're looking at it, you're wondering what is the point, what is the reason for doing these things? What is the point to conveying this very ornamental, very pretty, very attractive aesthetic? Possibly, could it be, just shooting from the hip here, could it be that the overdoing of design, the replete use of gold all throughout the salon, is meant to show us something, but perhaps also to cover something that in a manner has been lost? And what am I getting to as far as something that has been lost? There is a Roman concept from the Republican period of Rome. It was one of their great virtues, by the way, one of the Roman Republic's great virtues. It was called gravitas, G-R-A-V-I-T-A-S. It meant, for lack of a better English way of putting it, it meant a moral seriousness and weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. It meant substance. It meant that someone or something or some concept was worthy of something called respect. Someone who had lived a life with many challenges, not a very easy life, would be worth listening to simply because of the fact of going through this kind of existence. On a personal note, I grew up with parents who lived through World War II in the Philippines. I can honestly say that I had very rare occasions where I felt that I could talk back to my mother and father. One, because you never know what the corporal punishment might be. But at the same time, the second reason for this is I always thought to myself, Mom and Dad lived through the occupation of Manila during World War II. They've seen things that I could not dream of seeing. And I grew up, by the way, in the 1970s, in the Philippines, the 1980s, not exactly a peaceful period as well. But in comparison to my folks' times, it was a lot more pleasant than what they went through. Therefore, because of their experiences, you give them that sort of respect. Expanding from this, the figure of Winston Churchill, who during the rise of Nazism in Germany was one of the few voices who said, look, we can't go along with this. We can't, as the British people, as a country, as a civilization, we can't coexist with this type of, frankly, evil that is happening. And for a while, before Franklin Roosevelt finally makes his decision to join the efforts, Churchill was the only person essentially saying, I'm standing here to fight this kind of tyranny that's happening in Europe right now. He would be somebody who even the ancient Roman Republicans would say would have this kind of gravitas, would have this kind of weight. The classic example, of course, for gravitas was the Roman censor Marcus Cato the Elder. Cato was a veteran of the wars against Carthage. He was a military veteran. He was somebody whose job it was to remind wealthy Romans never to outdo their opulence, never to outdo their luxury, to always live within a certain kind of means, Because if you live it up too much, it makes the people at the bottom, yes, not even the bottom, but the plebeian class in Rome, you cause class conflict that way, of showing how luxurious your lives are. Cato was a man who would eat his food cold. He would eat with his slaves. He would train with soldiers who were fighting wars with him. He earned that kind of gravitas and weight because of the moral seriousness he had. Now, since I bring that up, well, I bring that up for a couple of reasons, actually. One is to ask, in the age we live in, we're in 2021 right now, we may hear during political cycles, we may hear journalists wonder which candidate at a certain debate has the right amount of gravitas, or one has it more than the other. But I guess I'm left asking the question, how do we determine, where do we find this in 2021? What you're not seeing in this room filled with Rococo beauty, this old sense of weight, which, by the way, is very, very much present in Baroque art, which I'll show you a little bit later on tonight. Where do we see this concept in 2021? Where is gravitas found? When do we see someone who walks into a room and we know that this person carries with them the substance that is worthy of respect? I see a comment from Jill. The city of Dubai, that perhaps is where we could find some gravitas today, as far as following laws and following certain social norms. Okay, very good. Any other points on this? Where is this found? I should confess that whenever I ask this question to my Western civilization students, there is a very long and weighty gravitas-filled moment of silence after I ask the question. It is most difficult for them to say, where do we find it today? I'll ask them following this, perhaps, excuse me, somebody just left something in the chat. This is so individual. Very good. So how do we determine on an individual basis, where do we find it? If we can't find it as far as in a group or a more general sense, how does one measure this? How does one find this?
Isn't the important question, how do we cultivate it, since it's so rare in our society?
I would agree, but how do we know it's rare if first we have to figure out what it is and where do we find it in our society? How can we spot it? We are living a couple of hundred years after the age of the Enlightenment, after the age of progress. Dawson is making a very subtle argument that one of the things lost during this time period specifically is this sense of weight, this sense of gravitas. That although we find beauty in Rococo design, we find great finery in Rococo design, we may not necessarily find the kind of substance we saw in art of a previous generation. There's something odd, by the way, also along with Rococo design and Rococo art of the Enlightenment, and that is this. It is meant to not impose a sense of hierarchy. It is not meant to impose, frankly, it's not meant to impose, period. It's meant to allow us to enjoy a much more egalitarian view of aesthetics. But here's the ironic part. What if those who champion this new, almost democratic view of aesthetics and of philosophy in general, what if those who champion this more or less flat, think of the building of Sanssouci, yes, sensibility of the Rococo, what if they begin saying that this kind of worldview is superior to others? That those worldviews where there is too much faith, where those worldviews which say there is too much superstition, those worldviews should be subordinated to something more advanced, more enlightened, more progressive. There is great confidence in the art and architecture of the Enlightenment and the age of progress. I'd like you to think about this idea. Oftentimes in human history, when you hit a very high point, when you hit an apex, if you will, of confidence, of good things happening to you in your civilization, it is not too long before this confidence morphs, shifts in a manner to something more resembling what the Greeks would call hubris, a pride that is not necessarily deserved, but a form of pride that is potentially ruinous to a civilization. So a little bit of something to think about. I'm going to stop share for a second, but I'm more than happy to address any questions you have from the first 4 visuals you've seen tonight. Just feel free. Oh, I see somebody in chat. Okay. Only by serious personal reflection. Very good. Can we find gravitas? Very interesting. I still like to find some sort of criteria of how we can find that today. Any questions and comments from what we've taken up tonight? Okay, from Harold, the last person I met was Colin Powell, and that was in 2011. He was a general, and these were Silicon Valley billionaires. Sure, somebody who was in a position of command and has a life experience of doing this. Good example.
But they referred to him.
Go ahead, please.
They deferred to him.
Yes.
If you know the background, he and I both lived in the South Bronx.
Okay.
1953, 54, 55. He's the nicest guy you ever want to meet.
Sure.
And when you have billionaires, all these guys from Harvard and Stanford deferring to him and calling him a general, that is gravitas.
Very much so. Of acknowledging that he has done something in his life that is worth them showing him that kind of respect.
Exactly.
Being a very nice person, nevertheless. Very good. Okay. I think I saw in the chat a comment, if somebody has gravitas from a biblical perspective. Very much so. Okay. So somebody who adheres to a certain standard of behavior would certainly be, or at least be consistent with that standard of behavior, would be worthy of gravitas in that sense. Okay. Any other questions and comments?
From the Old Testament, maybe Jeremiah.
You know the famous painting of Jeremiah at the fall of, I think it's the fall of Jerusalem, or it's where, I can't remember who painted it, but it's where he's sort of like holding his head while he's watching civilization fall all around him. I very much relate to that painting because that's usually how I feel during exam time. In my classes when I have to grade essays that perhaps are subpar, I go on a Jeremiah, during that time period. But very much so, somebody who realizes the errors that others are falling into, and nevertheless perhaps can't do enough to convince them to cease these ruinous actions. Okay, Nehemiah is worth considering also. Thank you, very good in chat.
And similar to Colin Powell, John McCain.
McCain, somebody who's been a war prisoner and lived through that experience as well. Very good. Okay.
Or Nelson Mandela.
Somebody who suffered injustice along those lines. Very good. All right. Any other questions and comments before we move further?
For those of you who may have missed Jose's previous presentations, if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see we have videos of not only Jose's previous presentations, but others, as well as videos by others. Really recommend it. So there's a rich repository of material and lots of things to do, see and do, and playlists, not only of our things, but of things that we find worthwhile in sharing, including Lewis, what are those called, doodles? Mm-hmm. Yeah, which are really, really wonderful little expositions on books and so on.
Great comment on the chat. I see Lech Wałęsa also being suggested by Harold as someone with gravitas. I would tend to agree, very much so. All right. Second portion of for tonight's presentation, we'll deal with what happens with that confidence that we left off with of the Enlightenment, that optimism, and what if that morphs or changes into something that is less promising. If I could link Lewis to Dawson tonight, it would be in mentioning a few years back, we did Mere Christianity as a book review, and a fascinating book, of course, by Lewis. One of the more interesting comments Lewis does in Mere Christianity, is he talks about the nature of pride. Lewis says that pride is one of the sins, but in a manner, it's a sin that makes all the other ones worse. Why? Lewis says a person who enjoys eating fine food, very high-calorie foods, very luxurious types of food, could simply be a glutton. A person who is not that driven in life could simply be a slothful person, or something along those lines. But when you add pride to these particular sins. They become augmented. They become much worse than they are. Why? Because pride at its very nature, according to C.S. Lewis, pride at its very nature is competitive. It thrives on having more than somebody else. And if you can't have more than somebody else, you don't want somebody else to have more than you. There is this constant comparison and wanting to have to one up essentially someone else in this process. So how would perhaps pride come into this rather optimistic period of the Enlightenment, this rather optimistic period of progress, which this era is bringing about? Well, people of the period begin thinking, since we have mastered the material world, or are in the process of mastering the material world, since our intellect's driven by human reason, not by anything divine, not by anything superstitious, but by human reason, since our minds and our rational capacities allow us to do so many things, to improve so many things, which is the whole point to progress, is that change leads to something better, not change leading to something worse. By the way, Dawson is making the case, yes, that change is always relative. You never know what's going to happen once you make a certain decision. Nevertheless, the progressive mind of the Enlightenment says, if we follow the right steps, give the right effort, we can improve most things. Now, here's where a bit of pride perhaps seeps into the equation. Not only are we going to improve physical things, transportation, medicine, science, believe it or not, we're going to improve warfare as well, because we're going to make deadlier weapons than we've seen before in human history. Not only are we going to improve things that are physical, but we are also going to improve human nature. We are going to make ourselves better than what our human nature dictates. There is a particularly telling line from Dawson here, and that is found on page 22 of the reading. It is found in the first broken paragraph up top, and it goes on to the second paragraph. This is one of the last sentences of the first paragraph. From Dawson, this apocalypse of reason was preparing the way for a true millennium, an age when, as Condorcet writes, the human race, freed from all its fetters, withdrawn from the empire of chance, as from that of the enemies of progress, would walk with firm and assured step in the way of truth, of virtue, and of happiness. End of quote. There's something that follows later in the next paragraph. This is from Dawson again. These ideas inspired the leaders of the French Revolution in their attempt to refashion society anew. They are clearly expressed in one of the decrees of the Committee of Public Safety in 1794. In quotes, the transition of an oppressed nation to a democracy, it runs, is like the effort by which nature rose from nothingness to existence. You must entirely refashion a people whom you wish to make free. Destroy its prejudices, alter its habits, limit its necessities, root up its vices, purify its desires. There was the thought during this time period, specifically the late 1700s in the French Revolution, that human nature itself could be improved upon, could be changed. Now with that in mind, there is an old voice from history that would say quite politely, or perhaps not so politely, no, it can't. That voice, of course, being the great historian Thucydides, perhaps the greatest historian in antiquity. Thucydides was a general who fought in the Peloponnesian War on the side of Athens. He wrote his account of this particularly tragic event in human history. Thucydides says that war is a very rough teacher. It makes lives miserable for those involved, and war will continue to be a rough teacher to humanity so long as human nature remains fixed, so long as human nature remains the same, unchanged. Thucydides will view the actions conducted by warring nations Sparta and Athens, who, by the way, Sparta and Athens once were, if I could call them this, teammates in the great Greco-Persian War. When Persia came a-calling, it was Athens and Sparta who said, okay, we're going to put aside all of our old ancestral grudges. We'll put aside all of this animus we've had for each other for a very long time, because we must stand up against the depredations of the Persian great king. But a mere 50 years after this great victory, where Greece, as literally the David that brought down the Goliath of the Persian Empire, Greece began not warring with somebody else, but began warring with itself, began picking fights with itself. Athens is usually blamed as having this great sense of pride. The sense of pride, by the way, of Athens was Athens believed it was so advanced. Its method of government was a democracy and therefore superior to all others. And it would like the world to be like itself. It would like to recreate the world literally in its own image, was the intention of Athens. In the process of this happening, there is a great loss of life. The Peloponnesian War, by the way, lasts a human generation, 27 years, almost 3 decades worth of fighting. This will destroy literally generations of people in terms of number. But the mark it has on Greek culture itself will also be quite severe. Greece will really stop being what it once was. And after this, once you have Alexander the Great, of course, a latter stage of Greek history, that looks a lot different than what Greece used to be before they fought the Persians, this great classical age of Greece. Now, Thucydides knows this very well. He knows that human nature, if we just use our eyes to observe, seemingly does not change. There is a very odd statistic, by the way, a very telling statistic, that would say in the last 3,400 years of human history, there have been roughly a little over 260 peaceful centuries. Peaceful years in that time. In 3.5 millennia, there's been literally 2.5 centuries of peace. There seems to be something about human nature that resurfaces from time to time in a rather baleful manner. The thinkers of the Enlightenment and the proponents of the Enlightenment and the proponents of progress would argue that given enough time, given the full unleashing of human reason, unfettered by superstition, by religion, we can move away from that way of being. We can move away to this, perhaps, and do away with human history and do away with human nature in that sense. So in a manner, of course, they are challenging Thucydides. But here's where things get interesting. They're actually also affirming Thucydides. They're actually also agreeing with Thucydides. Why? Because Thucydides would say that when times of strife, when times of violence and conflict, what the Greeks would call stasis, would occur in a society, human beings do not rise to the occasion. We fall to the occasion. We essentially become worse versions of ourselves. We turn opportunistic on other people. We turn perhaps predatory on other people in order to further our own self-interest and our own survival in those settings. Why is this actually in agreement? Why do we find Thucydides in an odd way and the proponents of progress in the Enlightenment actually agreeing and coming together here? Because of the things that people during the time of the Enlightenment and the age of progress will end up doing to each other. The French Revolution, of course, is the first flashpoint of this, where people said that we will actually remake the whole thing. We will no longer have ourselves tied or fettered by religion or some sort of links to some transcendent being. We're going to handle this all by ourselves. We will remake human nature. Now, that, of course, is more Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you're familiar with his writings in the late 1700s, if you give it another 80 years or so, you're eventually going to find somebody who says something a little bit different, but shares something a bit in common with Rousseau. And that, of course, being Karl Marx. Marx, like Rousseau, although very different, will come together on this one thing. They will come together with this concept, with this idea, that the group, the collective, is not only quantitatively more than the individual, the group and the collective is also qualitatively better than the individual. Your worth as an individual person is only so much so that you serve the greater whole or the greater collective. Where do we see this seen? Not necessarily in art, but also but perhaps in architecture, perhaps in engineering. Allow me to share this next graphic for today. You are probably familiar with the Berlin Wall, constructed in 1961. This was a memorial put up, of course, decades later, to remember, to give respect, to pay some sort of homage, not to people who built the wall, but these are people whose pictures are visited by their families. Flowers are left as a remembrance, perhaps some sort of other sort of reminders. But these are people, all of these pictures. This is a memorial of people who lost their lives trying to escape the Berlin Wall. When one thinks of great walls constructed in human history, Great Wall of China, of course, is the most famous, built to deter barbaric nomads on the outside from harming the people within. Another wall from history during the Peloponnesian War itself, as I was mentioning Thucydides earlier, the long walls of Athens, built to keep up the might of the Spartan army, of the Spartan hoplites. The great walls of Constantinople, majestic in their engineering, built over the centuries, that made the city basically impregnable for about 1,000 years, until finally superior strength in numbers and cannon fire by Ottoman Turks brought down that wall in the 1450s, 1453. When we think of all of those walls in human history, there is one basic physical principle, yes? It's a rather simple one. Those walls were built to keep something out, to keep those whom you viewed as enemies on the outside, to protect the people inside who of course you related to, who were your own people if you were the sovereign, who were your fellow citizens whatsoever. They were connected to you to keep them from harm. It is one of the unique aspects of the ideologies that spawned from the age of enlightenment and the age of progress, that perhaps for the very first time in human history, we see a wall built, we see a wall armed, we see a wall designed specifically to keep people from getting outside it. It is as if somebody told you, our way of living is so superior to the decadent West. It is so much better than what you see on the outside. And in order to protect you from yourself, we are going to kill you if you try to escape these walls. Human reason was one of the great points championed by the age of progress and the Enlightenment, yes? Yet, it would seem that this would be a rather irrational thing to say to one's population, that this wall is not really protecting you, it's really perhaps protecting something else along these lines. The actual wall itself is more telling, perhaps, than, well, I shouldn't say more telling, but it is equally as telling as this memorial. When I first saw this in 2015 and took the picture from across the field, I thought to myself, I pride myself in being a pretty adequate professor and lecturer, and being able to convey certain ideas that may or may not be immediately understandable. However, when I saw this for the first time, it probably dawned on me that the graffiti found here, it's probably the first and only time I'll ever say this, but the graffiti found on this portion of the Berlin Wall communicates much more than I ever could in terms of the pathos, of the sense of loss, of the people who had to live under this regime for decades, where you had family who were living outside the wall, whom you could not see because of political reasons, who were not allowed to come and visit you, that you had families parted, not because of any great war, mind you, but parted because the state simply saw fit to draw a line between its people and their own relatives and their own families living on the outside. there is a sense that the confidence of the Enlightenment, the confidence of the era of progress, may morph into something far worse. If there is no verticality, as mentioned earlier, yes, if we are not depending on something transcendent to beyond human existence, to give our lives meaning and reference points, if we are only looking around ourselves, here's one of the great ironies about that. Sometimes when we are only looking around ourselves, we are not looking at each other. We are seeing human beings not as people who are whole, who are the whole, who are not just their attributes or who are not just members of a certain group, but seeing human beings in their wholeness. If we're not looking at people and paying attention to them, then we tend to view people as abstract concepts. When we view people as people, we see human beings. When we think abstractly, we say humanity, which, by the way, is a departure from human beings. There's a great chasm between viewing people from one way and the other. Perhaps there is a message here that Dawson is giving us hints to. The message being, if we progress forward, if we progress further away from something else, yes, if the era of progress in the Enlightenment is truly a move away from something we consider to be old, atavistic, archaic, superstitious, and religious, then might we have to ask the question, if we define progress as something moving away from that, what exactly are we moving to? It's easy to say where you're moving away from because it's right there. And by the way, one of the interesting things about history and what Dawson will point out time and time again, I'm paraphrasing the historian Will Durant here, who once wrote, again, I'm paraphrasing, that the thing about history and why it's valuable is that you're not really dealing with hypotheticals. You're dealing with things that actually happen. So you're not really a theorist, somebody who's coming up with these, fancy sort of theories to imagine how the world would be if you only did this. An historian is actually looking at what actually happened. And from looking at what happened, can we find patterns? And there is this one specific pattern of human nature that when pride, going back to Lewis, takes hold of us, either individually or as a group, the consequences that follow are quite dire. The consequences that follow are quite sobering for all humanity or human beings involved in question. Now, in order to perhaps forestall or perhaps give us some sort of sense of direction, Dawson will say that as we progress forward in this era of the Enlightenment, yes, in this era of progress, as we move forward, we have to not lose sight with something very important about human nature, that we are quite complex, that although we are able to master in this era of progress in the Enlightenment, although we are able to master the material universe, the material world, we are not all matter. There is something more to us. And we see this by looking at how people think, by looking at how people specifically believe. If I could draw your attention to the last quote of the evening, this is on page 67 of Progress and Religion. Dawson will talk about how the true divisions that exist amongst people are not merely things like politics or geography, things that are material. They're actually something more. There's something beyond that. This is from the first full paragraph on page 67, a paragraph that begins with "it is true." If you scroll down a bit, this sentence begins with "two peoples." Two peoples, this is from Dawson, two peoples may possess a common geographical environment and a common racial type, and yet differ entirely in culture if they do not share the same intellectual tradition. Scroll further down a bit. The ultimate barriers between peoples are not those of race or language or region, but those differences of spiritual outlook and tradition, which are seen in the contrast of the Hellene and barbarian, Jew and Gentile, Muslim and Hindu, Christian and pagan. In all such cases, there is a different conception of reality, different moral and aesthetic standards. In a word, a different inner world. Behind every civilization, there is a vision which may be the unconscious fruit of ages of common thought and action, or which may have sprung from the sudden illumination of a great prophet or thinker. Here, Dawson is reminding those who proceed quite rapidly in the era of progress and the Enlightenment that we should not neglect the wholeness of the human experience, that we are not on this earth simply to enjoy what is material to this world. There is something more and beyond this. There are two specific paintings that I'd like to draw your attention to as a means of showing this. The first of these perhaps illustrates one kind of worldview. This is a ceiling painting in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. By the way, if you are ever in the city of Florence, I'm a big proponent of Italy in general. I'm also a proponent of Florence as a wonderful city. The Palazzo Pitti, of course, was built by a rival to the Medici family, the Pitti family. Eventually, the Pitti family would not do so well economically speaking, and the Medicis would eventually take over this great palace in Florence. On the side, by the way, just to throw on the side, if you exit the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, if you take a left, more or less, once you exit the building of the entrance of the Palazzo, you will find a house where the poets Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning once lived in their stay in Florence. Quite a romantic place to visit. Right around the corner of that house, of the Browning house, uniquely enough, you'll find the best gelateria in all of Florence. Best ice cream I've ever had in that city. So if you're ever in Florence, head to the Pitti, get some gelato, look at the Browning house, all in one day. Great experience. Now, this painting was produced by an artist called Luigi Sabatelli. He was a neoclassical artist. Neoclassical art would follow the Rococo period or genre in terms of art. We're talking more or less time-wise the early 19th century. So the early 1800s, give or take, when this movement would really would move forward. The emphasis with neoclassical art was to sort of move away Rococo design, which was at a certain point considered too ornamental, almost too overdone. The spirit was to move back to a much more classic, clean, I would say lean interpretation of aesthetics without unnecessary refinements, simply producing art in a vein of how the ancient Greeks once produced art. So Sabatelli, of course, is portraying for us here. I'm going to zoom just a little bit more to get a better scope. Sabatelli is portraying, of course, Mount Olympus and the various Greek gods you see arrayed in front of you. You see Zeus, and perhaps here there is verticality, i.e. Zeus being higher than all the other gods. He is the sky father, of course, the main god of Olympus. He is seated on the throne, holding what looks like some sort of ceremonial scepter to acknowledge his superiority over the other gods. You see his brothers sitting by his side. His brother Hades. By the way, he's not looking too happy. I'm guessing that's because he lost the draw of the Olympian, the children of Kronos, to see who would be the head god of all Olympus. He, of course, was banished to the underworld. We see his other brother, Poseidon, the earth shaker, with his trident, looking perhaps admiringly or loyally to his brother Zeus. Bear in mind again what I asked you to look for in the earlier paintings today: color palette and characters. So color palette involved sky blue, a healthy use of gold and white to communicate this, or perhaps give this impression of something heavenly, or at least Olympian by aesthetic design. Secondly, look at characters. Look at what the characters are doing. And why do I bring this up? Specifically, if one looks at the other gods and their relationship to Zeus, who, by the way, of course, is the chief god of Olympus, yes? Which god is directly looking at Zeus? Well, perhaps his brother Poseidon over here is looking at his brother. His wife, Hera, queen of the gods, is looking at her husband. By the way, she doesn't look too amused, does Hera, in looking at her husband. You, of course, know that although Zeus was indeed Hera's husband and also her brother, he was quite unreserved in his capacity for dalliances with earthly women, whether or not he was married to Hera. She's not perhaps looking at him not in so much an admiring, with an admiring gaze, but more perhaps, oh, here's Zeus again. Here's this guy who makes my life miserable for eternity, or whatever, in terms of emotion. If one looks over here, on the left side of the picture, just a little bit more. The goddess of beauty herself, Aphrodite, her husband, the craftsman, Hephaestus, the Romans will call him Vulcan, her son, Cupid, with his arrow right here. But who is Aphrodite looking at? It's not her husband, by the way. She's looking at Mars, or Ares, as the Greeks, of course, would call him, the god of war. What does this tell us? This glance between Ares and Aphrodite, this look, not necessarily an approving look from Hera to Zeus. What this tells us is that the Greek gods, and even the Greeks who worship them, the Greek gods were not necessarily moral paragons. The Greek gods lacked, for all of their power, for all of their immortality, they lacked gravitas. They lacked a moral weight. We prayed to the gods because they would give us something. But we did not pray to the gods because we considered them to be morally superior to us. When we honored them because we wanted something in return. We did not honor them because it was due to them, because they deserved the honor that we gave them. There was something about them that took liberties simply because they lived forever. They could never really die. They could never really suffer the consequences of their actions. Nevertheless, they were immortal, they lived forever, and therefore the Greeks would have to show them some form of worship, all the while knowing that they may be even morally worse than themselves, morally worse than people. Think about it for a second. If a human being does something that is in his or her heart bad or evil, there perhaps is a feeling of guilt. There perhaps is a feeling that I would have a hard time making this up to the other person because one day I'm going to die. My life will end on this earth. But if you're an Olympian god who lives forever, there's really no mistakes because you really don't have to suffer for very long because you do live forever. The consequences of your actions may at some point peter out, but you'll still be here. Color palette and characters. All of these characters in the painting, or at least I should say the majority of the characters in this painting, are looking to their own devices. They're sort of paying attention to their own lots in life. They're paying attention to what they want out of life, their own dominions, their own sort of spheres of being. This is something, by the way, I often tell Western civilization students I have in class when I try to argue that monotheism, by its nature, is stronger than polytheism. One of the reasons why polytheism is perhaps weaker than monotheism is because when you have gods of something, Hades is the god of the underworld. Poseidon is the god of the sea. Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty and love. Ares is the god of war. What you have in this situation are gods who have neighborhoods, who are very powerful and very strong and influential in their neighborhoods. But once you get beyond that picket fence, they're not all that, because that's somebody else's neighborhood. And therefore, they tend to stick to where they're most comfortable. To the Olympian gods, pleasure and comfort is the great reward. That is what we're doing things for. We want to be as less troubled by the actions of these mortals. We want to spend our eternity more or less in peace. We may play with mortal lives, but that's more for amusement, because our attention is not towards anything else, but really what we want to do in this life or in this existence. You don't see gravitas. I would also argue you don't see verticality. Aside from Zeus being higher than the others, you don't see a very strict hierarchy in this realm of Olympus. As I mentioned that, allow me to share something that could not be more different in its appearance. This painting of the Baroque style, I know I've mentioned the genre many times before, but we're seeing an example of this. This is by a Florentine artist by the name of Ludovico Cardi. He is also known as Cigoli. He was a late Mannerist artist in Italy. The late Manneristic period eventually becomes the Baroque. Eventually, the Manneristic era of art, with limbs like Michelangelo sort of stretching to the heavens. Titian is also known for doing this. That stops being as important. Technique stops being overly important. And now the feeling of conveying to the masses, again, this is the Baroque period. So the Catholic Church is trying to re-emphasize its strength after the Reformation. It's meant to convey emotion, grandeur, severity of feeling. It's meant specifically to convey gravitas to people. Now, this work was called Trinita, which means, of course, Trinity or Holy Trinity. This is found at the Santa Croce Church in Florence. That is the Franciscan church in the city, a beautiful site, by the way. Again, if you visit, should very much make it one of your points of visit or of destination on that trip. What do we see here? If I could zoom in slightly, we see God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, and God the Son. In this case, Christ, as he is laying after his death at the cross. What do we notice about this? Please think color palette. Very different from what you saw earlier with Sabatelli, with Olympus. You don't see a blue sky. You don't see the pleasantness of a blue sky. Rather, if you look up a little bit, the sky is rather foreboding. These are dark clouds forming at the very top. What is giving light or having light pierce through these dark clouds is the light of the divinity itself, of God himself, as he is viewing the sacrifice of his son. Again, very Baroque, transitions from very dark colors to light, especially here by the torso of Jesus, re-emphasizing the contrast, you see, igniting, if you will, a bit of emotionality in people. We're not looking necessarily at something pleasant, more so something quite dramatic, quite moving in what it's trying to convey. Now, color palette is one thing. Think secondly, think characters. The faces of angels, perhaps here, these cherubs, may be looking at each other, but more likely they're looking towards the middle. The two angels by the side of the fallen Christ are looking with great care and concern towards him and his sacrifice. God the Father up top is looking down at Jesus, and it could be an argument could be made here as well that the eyes are also in a vertical fashion coming down to us as the viewer. There is very much verticality in this painting. There is very much gravitas and weight with this painting. How do we know there is weight? Think of it this way. This is an extremely loving God the Father. At the very bottom of the painting, this is his son, whom he loves quite well, who was not only an innocent man who was made to suffer capital punishment, but he was the most innocent of men. He was, in fact, without sin, but nevertheless undertakes this sacrifice in order, essentially, to save the rest of us. What is the nature of this sacrifice? If you look towards the feet of Jesus, signs of what he went through. The whip or the lash down here, lower right-hand section. A hammer that nailed him onto the cross. A stick holding up a sponge with which vinegar was fed to God as he was dying on the cross. What looked like tools of torture, of setting up the cross itself. It looks like right over here, the spear tip that pierced him on his side. Not only a brutal way of killing someone, but the ultimate act of insult that we as human beings, who are so far less than the divinity himself, would bring the most innocent, the best of all of us, to this kind of death. Now, please note what you're not seeing here. You're not seeing some sort of pleasant world that you saw in Olympus. What is being conveyed here is that this world is a harsh world. It's not a world where you're going to see heaven created. Counter what the Enlightenment era, the era of progress would say. You will never be able to create heaven on earth. In fact, the many times in which that was tried, you actually end up with the opposite of heaven on earth. 20th century, of course, is full of examples of this being the case. But what you also don't see in the painting, when we look at the figures and how they're all focused inward at the body of the most innocent of all of us, suffering the most, the greatest indignity of a death. What you're not seeing is these angels suddenly reaching over to pick up a sword. You're not seeing God the Father saying, okay, that's it. You guys did this to my son. We're going to have flood version 2. No, you're not seeing that. You are not seeing vendetta. You are not seeing revenge. Now, why is this important? Because if you crossed one of the Olympian gods, the punishment for this would be quite high. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, when King Minos of Crete thinks he can fool Poseidon by giving him not his prize bull, but some other bull because he wants to keep his prize to himself, Poseidon will see to it that the king's wife will be impregnated by a bull and bring forth a horrible creature called the Minotaur, and Poseidon laughing his way into the sea. You think you're going to pull a fast one on me? No, that's not going to happen. I'm going to pull a fast one on you too. When someone who worshipped the Olympian gods, Alexander the Great, when he mounted his siege of a city called Tyre, which was more or less in modern day Lebanon today, when Alexander sends emissaries to the leaders of Tyre to say, just surrender now, we'll take it easy on you, don't worry, but just surrender because we don't want to fight unnecessarily. What do the leaders of Tyre in their hubris do? They take the emissaries of Alexander, put them up on the walls of their city so Alexander on the outside can see them. And the Tyrians, the people of Tyre, torture these men, execute them, and throw them into the Mediterranean. What is Alexander's response to this? When Alexander finally takes Tyre, it takes him a while, by the way, but when he finally seizes that city by very ingenious engineering, building causeways across open water. But when he finally seizes that city and bursts it open with his invasion, Alexander sees to it that he crucifies 2,000 men on the beach of Tyre to tell them, you don't slight me. If you cause me offense, I will return it back. That is justice. That is the way of the world. But what is this painting by Cigoli saying? The way of the world is not always the best way. There is another way that says all of the temptations, all of the success, all of the pleasures that this world could give you are not really that fulfilling, are perhaps not having as much meaning. Where do we see this again in the painting? If you notice with Jesus and how he is laying as he is dead, the placement of his legs, by the way, communicates something to us. This is an old technique from Byzantine art. This is something I went over last year in the presentation on crisis of Western education. Byzantine art would portray, because of course they were not yet experts in the kind of art that would come around during the Renaissance. But Byzantine artists would purposely put one leg of a figure higher than the other to convey that there was almost a forward motion coming down to us as the viewer. This kind of leg placement, this kind of body positioning is meant to convey to us, and I'm very surprised, by the way, that Cigoli would use this, considering that he was by no means a Byzantine artist. He's very much a Florentine, a Renaissance era artist. But why this is notable is when you have the legs placed in this way, pointing towards us, the viewer, the body placement is meant to create a space a space open to us as the viewer to contemplate what is happening in the painting. It is meant to help us communicate with the painting by creating this space. And this is a God whose father is not wanting revenge for the sacrifice of his son, who is creating this space for us to communicate and to contemplate the nature of this sacrifice, to realize that if it was only justice, if it was only the way of the world. An old mentor of mine who also taught my sister at Georgetown University, Father James Scholl, he recently passed a couple of years ago, one of the great giants of Jesuit education. Scholl would say quite poignantly that when you think of virtues, justice is a virtue, but justice is the most terrible of all virtues. With justice, there are no loopholes. If you live a wretched life, you will pass away alone on a ditch somewhere. It is because of this that Judeo-Christian thought gives us something more than justice, more than the way of the world. It gives us mercy, something that does not need to be given, that is a gift that we don't deserve, frankly, but is there to give us hope in difficult times. This is the one worldview that Dawson is saying should not be forgotten with all of the advancements of the era of progress and the era of the Enlightenment. That human beings are not just on this earth to enjoy the material pleasures and comforts of this world, but rather meant to live this life, not abuse this life, but to live this life with one eye turned towards something else, to returning home, to returning to something which will cause us greater happiness in the end. If you would have any questions so far on the presentation, I have one last quote I'd like to share with you, but I'm kind of holding that back in my back pocket because that bridges from this meeting to the next meeting, which will focus more on religion. We tackled progress now. The next meeting we'll be looking at how Dawson views religion and ultimately its relationship to progress. So before I get any further, more than happy to answer any questions. I'm looking at chat really quickly to see. From Antonia, the gods were just like any discordant earthly human family, though they live forever. Very much so. I would agree with this. From Harold again. Harold, would you want to elaborate on this, or when you were speaking about Durant?
Yeah. So essentially, I'm a double E. I'm not really into this stuff. So this is new to me. So I'm saying I don't have time to read the 11 volumes of Durant. I saw it in the library. Is there a crib version or a course, in Berkeley or Stanford that I can get a background
of history? You mean like a short?
Will Durant's History of Civilization. Give me a flavor of Will Durant.
I'm not aware of a shorter version. As far as history goes, of course, there are many great history authors. I'd put forward if a great source specifically of classical history. Donald Kagan from Yale is particularly astute. Victor Davis Hanson as well. Two great sources on the classical world and how what occurred then may seep further permutations today. Mark, you have your hand up.
I'm wondering what you think Christopher Dawson would say about our progress, quote unquote, since he died in 1970.
Good question. Right, actually, when I was born was when he passed away. It's a strange connection why I like him so much, why I like reading him so much. I'd say that Dawson, the Catholic side of him, would always say to not despair. After all, despair, in a manner, is a form of pride. It's the belief that somehow, the rigors and horrors we live through, we can never be saved by them. So Dawson himself, I don't think, would despair, but being the professor that he was, he would always ask us to bear in mind to not fall into excesses, to enjoy the success we have, to enjoy the advancements of science and of progress and the Enlightenment. Again, I'm very grateful we have antibiotics, in 2021. It'd be very hard to live without them. But nevertheless, to not be overly focused on that, where we begin straying into excesses. The Berlin Wall, of course, the French Revolution are classic examples of this, where the belief that we could recreate or refashion human nature is taken to its extent, it's taken to its limit, and it's far from a heavenly vision. So I'd say doubly, he would not despair, but he would always ask us, encourage us in a very professorial, in a very erudite way, which he could, to bear in mind not stumbling into things that are particularly human to stumble into.
Would he be discouraged by the decline in Christianity in the United States?
Interesting in that Dawson, I've read, has actually more of a following in the United States than he has in the UK, which is quite interesting considering he's, of course, native to the UK. I'd say that Dawson would hold that as long as there are people who take seriously, again, gravitas of their faith, who are willing to come together in groups like this, that may not be overly large or sort of mass-oriented, but as long as there are people who are willing to invest their time in reading and thinking, in not necessarily focusing overly in the moment, but like him, again, we're not Dawson, I'm not even close to Dawson's league, I'll be the first person to say that, but at least to be willing to see things through history as he does, in huge panoramas, and be able to understand these are not just bullet points. There are things that are connecting all of this. If we're aware of history, we're more aware of ourselves. Human history, I'm often asked from students in class, Mr. Yulo or Professor Yulo, is history really cyclical? And I'll say no. Rather, human history, it's one story. It's a narrative. We keep on committing the same mistakes over and over. Our toys change. The things we play with change. We become more clever in terms of technological development. But as far as human nature goes, the same things that Hammurabi the Great in ancient Babylon considered bad, murder, theft, adultery, frankly, we still consider bad today. We just punish them differently. But we have the same, or at least a similar moral compass that says some things should not be done. Hope that answers in a roundabout way. Any other questions from folks today? I'd like to leave you with a quote, and this is not from Dawson, but it's something I just found out the other day. This quote that I'd like to end today with is sort of our link to next week's class. This is from the Victorian era British poet Matthew Arnold. He was considered one of the three great poets of his generation. I believe Tennyson is probably considered the superior poet during that time period. But Matthew Arnold would write, Dover Beach, by the way, just on the side, is a particularly good poem by Matthew Arnold, very enjoyable to read and to listen to. But he will say of something, since we're part of the Lewis group, that we value something called freedom. Matthew Arnold will say, freedom is a very good horse to ride, but to ride somewhere. If I could borrow from Arnold and say that progress is an equally good horse to ride, the question then becomes, where are we going? If freedom is movement, specifically if freedom is movement away from something, what exactly is the point at which we're aiming? Because if we are merely riding away from something with great haste, then we should be very aware that there may be divots on the road. There may be brambles. There may be low-hanging branches that would give our ride on this horse quite a bit of difficulty. So think about where this progress is going, where it's sort of aiming, what should it aim towards? And this will be our bridge basically before our talk next time in 2 weeks. And this is where Dawson will focus more on religion. Any questions before I go? You guys are, can I entertain anything?
One could say that it's not so much a question of what we're fleeing from in our search for freedom, but what are we fleeing to, which is really...
It would be logical, at least, yes, or rational, that the point at which we are fleeing to, the B that we're going from A, toward, would have to be at least in some manner better or superior than what we were moving away from. Yes, but how do we deem that to be superior? What are the qualifications? What is the criteria for that destination to be better than what we're leaving from? Okay. It's been a great night. I'm very happy to share with you all, and I look forward to seeing you all again next time for the discussion.